At 07:31 on the morning of September 18, 1944, a 19-year-old Marine named Arthur Jackson realized he had run out of options that made sense. He was jammed up against a ragged chunk of coral on Peleliu's southern peninsula. The rock was hot from the sun and sharp enough to cut through his utilities. Every time he tried to raise his head more than an inch, bullets chewed the stone just above him, stinging his face with white chips. 5 minutes earlier, he'd had a squad with him. Now he had nobody. Behind him, the Marines who'd tried to cross the open ground were either dead, lying still on pale coral, or pinned so far back they couldn't help him. In front of him, stretching in a rough half-moon across a shallow ridge, were concrete pillboxes and trenches filled with Japanese soldiers who had just watched him end up alone on their side of the killing ground. He carried a Browning automatic rifle, the bar cradled along his forearms. He had maybe 5 magazines of 30 .06 left, a couple of grenades, sweat running down his back, a sick, dry taste in his mouth. Intelligence said there were roughly a dozen pillboxes across this arc, each holding anywhere from 5 to 30-plus defenders. Even the low estimate for the sector directly in front of him put something like 54 Japanese within a few dozen yards. They knew exactly where he was. They had every reason to kill him as slowly and painfully as they could. He was cut off, alone, and close enough to be an object lesson for everyone still watching from the American lines. The obvious choices were all bad. He could try to crawl backward over the ground that 3 machine guns and a knee mortar had already dialed in. That meant turning his back on the fire and hoping nothing hit him between the shoulder blades. He could stay flat and wait, hoping someone else would solve this ridge before someone dropped a grenade or mortar into his bit of cover, or he could do what no one had written in any FM 710 manual. He could go forward, alone, straight at the positions that had chewed his squad apart. Jackson pressed his helmet tighter down. He slid one palm forward on the bar's fore end and felt the familiar roughness under his fingers. He breathed once, slow. Then he began to move. 7 minutes later, the half-moon of pillboxes in front of him would be silent, gutted concrete. Everyone in them would be dead. And the men up on that ridge looking down at the southern tip of Peleliu would be trying to figure out what the hell they'd just seen a 19-year-old private do. To understand why one barman ended up doing the work of a platoon, you have to step back from that piece of coral and look at the island that had funneled him there. Peleliu was supposed to be a sideshow. It became a preview of hell. On paper, Peleliu was a little job, an island about 6 miles long in the Palau group, with a single Japanese airfield and a garrison of roughly 10,000 men. The operation to take it was codenamed Stalemate 2. The theory, sitting in planners' offices in Hawaii and Brisbane, went like this. Land the 1st Marine Division. Knock out the airfield. Mop up resistance. Turn the island over to the army to garrison. Move the Marines on to bigger things. Lieutenant General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, was an experienced hard man. He had fought at Guadalcanal. He had seen jungle war up close. He looked at Peleliu's size and its garrison and told his officers something that would haunt him. We'll be in on Saturday and out by Wednesday. 3 or 4 days of brutal fighting, yes, but no more. The calendar said mid-September 1944. MacArthur was pushing toward Leyte in the Philippines from the southwest. Nimitz was dry, Ving across the Central Pacific toward the Marianas and beyond. Peleliu's airfield sat on a line of advance toward the Philippines. Its bombers and reconnaissance planes could, in theory, threaten American moves. Take the strip, get fighters operating from it, and you cut one more set of Japanese eyes and claws off the map. That was the logic. What the maps and photos didn't show was what Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had done to the place. Japanese island defenses early in the Pacific War had followed a fairly consistent script. Meet the invader on the beach. Throw him back with fire and counterattacks, often with suicidal banzai charges when things went bad. Tarawa in November 1943 had been a grotesque example of that mentality. But the price the Japanese paid for that was obvious. Thousands of their best troops died in frontal assaults against Marine machine guns and naval gunfire. They had nothing left to fight with once the survivors had been pushed back a few hundred yards. By 1944, some field commanders in the Imperial Japanese Army had learned a harsh lesson. If you want to bleed the Americans, bleeding out in the first 48 hours on the beach is not the way. Colonel Nakagawa was one of those officers. Given responsibility for Peleliu's defense, he chose not to defend the waterline with everything he had. He built a fortress inland, and he made the island itself the weapon. Peleliu was made of coral and limestone, not flat sand. Its northern half was a maze of ridges and gullies called the Umurbrogol, soon to be known to the Marines as Bloody Nose Ridge. Even in the south, where the ground was lower and nearer the beaches, there were knobby uplifts and outcroppings. Nakagawa's engineers bored into those ridges. They expanded cave systems. They poured reinforced concrete bunkers into hillsides. They linked positions with tunnels up to 500 yards long. He sighted heavy machine guns and light artillery, not on crests, but on reverse slopes and in cave mouths that could fire across the island's approaches in interlocking patterns. In the southern peninsula, below the airfield, he laid out a semicircle of 12 pillboxes and blockhouses across a low rise facing the American lines. Each was a tough, low structure with firing slits just a foot or two above the ground. Some had as few as 5 men inside. Others, larger, might hold 30-plus defenders. All of them were connected by trenches and communication tunnels. If you knocked one out from the front, the next two could open up on you from left and right. If you tried to bypass them, they could fire into your flanks and back. Nakagawa had roughly 10,000 troops. He planned to make every bunker and cave kill 10 Marines. On the other side, Rupertus had 17,000 Marines in his division. His promise of 3 days was about to collide with those coral ridges in ways no one had fully grasped. PFC Arthur Jackson landed into that collision. Jackson was not some pre-war professional. He'd grown up in Maine, worked odd jobs, and enlisted in the Marine Corps at 17, early in the war. Boot camp at Paris Island, infantry training, weapons familiarization. He'd been picked out as a good shot and good with the bar. In the tables of organization, an infantry squad's barman was part of its firepower base. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't supposed to be a squad leader. He was supposed to be the man who put out a lot of accurate bullets when others needed cover. By the time the 1st Marine Division left their rest area on Pavuvu to head for Peleliu, Jackson had already seen something of jungle and island war. The division had been blooded on Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. Pavuvu had been a kind of purgatory in between, mosquito-ridden coconut groves and endless drills. On the troop ships heading toward Peleliu, men swapped guesses about what this one would be like. Short, some said. Hard, others added. But short. On September 15th, at 0832, Jackson and his comrades in 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, went ashore in a world that did not care about optimism. The landings on Peleliu's western beaches looked, at a glance, like Tarawa all over again. Navy and Marine frontline accounts from that morning are full of phrases like, worst I'd seen, thickest fire yet, and men stepping off into hell. Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns, mortars, and artillery that had survived the pre-invasion bombardment opened up on the LVTs and LCVPs as they crossed the reef. Boats burned. Men died in the water. Survivors clung to coral and then dashed across sand churned into bloody paste. Jackson's regiment, the 7th Marines, pushed inland toward the airfield after the initial scramble. There, the ground changed character. Instead of palm fringes and sand, there was flat, hard coral, glare so bright it hurt to look at, and sweltering heat. shallow tank scrapes, scraggly scrub, and then, looming beyond, the Umurbrogel Ridges and the southern blockhouse line. Over the next 2 days, D+1 and D+2, the 7th Marines did the unglamorous work of expanding the beachhead. They filled in holes. They knocked out immediate resistance near the strip. They took casualties from snipers and hidden machine guns. Jackson fired his bar in anger for the first time and likely hit men. But in that kind of firestorm, counting kills is a peacetime fantasy. By the morning of September 18th, D+3, he was still, officially, at 0. That morning, his platoon got the kind of order every infantryman dreads: advance into a proven kill zone and finish the job their friends had already died trying to start. The target was the southern pillbox arc, a belt of 12 mutually supporting positions cut into a coral rise across the southern tip. Company I had already thrown men at it. Each time they'd done serious damage. Satchel charges placed under embrasures cracked concrete. Small teams had knocked out individual nests. But the arc remained intact. It was like trying to pull one tooth at a time from a jaw that kept biting back. Jackson's squad leader, a staff sergeant whose name most accounts don't record, because Medal of Honor stories focus on one man, pointed out their line of advance. "See that outcrop?" he said, indicating a lump of coral sticking like a knuckle from the otherwise smooth slope. "We're going up to there. Use it for cover, then we push on that bunker." It made tactical sense. The outcrop sat slightly off to the left of the direct approach, offering at least a little defilade from the worst frontal fire. From there, a small group might get grenades and bar fire into the flank of one key pillbox whose guns had been tearing into previous assaults. If they could neutralize that position, maybe the rest of the company could shove a wedge into the arc and roll it up. Jackson took his place in the formation. Being the barman, he tended to operate around the middle of the squad, forward enough to put fire on what the point man saw, back enough to provide covering bursts. They moved out in a crouch, stepping from one bit of coral shadow to another. The first 100 feet went tolerably. Japanese gunners either didn't see this small movement or chose to hold their fire in hopes of killing more men at once. The squad reached the last real piece of cover before the outcrop, a waist-high coral lip. Beyond that was a shallow saddle of open coral maybe 20 yards across. On the far side, the outcrop itself, then the Japanese. They had to cross that saddle. The squad leader gave the signal. "Go!" Jackson surged up and forward with the others. As his boots hit the open coral, all 3 heavy machine guns in the nearest pillboxes opened up. The first burst of Japanese fire didn't sound like it does in movies. It wasn't a distant chattering. It was a harsh, buzzing slap as bullets struck rock, men, and gear. Jackson heard the whine past his ear and the sharp, meaty thuds as bullets hit flesh nearby. The Marine just to his left, a friend from training whose jokes he could still remember verbatim years later, was halfway through a stride when an unseen round took him cleanly. He folded as if the ground had reached up and smacked him. Another man behind Jackson yelped and went down, clutching his leg. Instinct took over. Jackson dove, head first, toward the outcrop they'd been aiming for. His helmet banged against the coral. His bar dug into his shoulder. He rolled, coming up behind the rock, sucking breath. Behind him, the rest of the squad did what experience and fear both demanded. They fell back toward the last cover, toward the rest of the company. Some dragged wounded. Some crawled. Some didn't move at all. Japanese knee mortars began plopping bombs into the saddle and back along the Marines' line. From Jackson's position, he could see little slices of the battlefield. To his rear, glimpses of khaki moving back, hugging the ground. To his left and right, the edge of the outcrop and the deadly bright coral beyond. In front of him, maybe 30 yards away, the angled face of the nearest pillbox. And more importantly, the side of it that was not directly facing the main American line. He understood immediately what had happened. His squad's attempt to get forward had failed. He was the only one who'd overshot. He was alone. From the Japanese position, this was almost ideal. They had turned back another assault. They had at least one American in an awkward, exposed place. He could be dealt with at leisure. From the American side, up on the main line, company commanders and platoon sergeants marked Jackson's last known position and mentally wrote him off. They couldn't see him. They saw an outcrop and a curtain of fire. Any attempt to get up to him would just add more bodies to that saddle. Peleliu's miserable math repeated itself. You could not spend squads for the sake of one man, no matter how much you wanted to. Jackson had to decide what he was: a pinned-down Marine waiting to die, or a man with the one thing this kind of defense feared: proximity. The bar wasn't a sniper rifle. But at 30 yards, firing into embrasures and doorways, it was more than enough gun. And grenades, rough, dependable pineapple Mech 2s, could do what he shells from 100 yards away sometimes couldn't, if you got them into the right hole. He took stock automatically. Bar, full magazine in, 4 more in the pouches. That meant around 100 rounds. Grenades, 2 frag, 1 smoke. Canteen, light. Throat, dry as sand. Heart, hammering. He remembered later being angry. Not just scared. Angry at what these positions had done to his friends. Angry at the idea that he was going to die as a bug under a microscope. That anger and youth tilted the scales. He decided that if he was likely dead either way, he would pick the manner of it. He would go forward. The trick in those first movements was to make himself invisible to men who were, by all accounts, very good at watching. The Japanese machine gunners had engaged the larger assault, then shifted to spray likely cover points and movement corridors. They were not, however, omniscient. Their gun apertures had limited arcs. Their attention was focused mainly on the main American line. Jackson flattened further, then began to slither along the base of the coral outcrop, like a lizard hugging a wall. Every few feet, he'd pause, listen for any change in the stuttering machine gun pattern, then move again. As he edged around, he got his first proper view of the flank of the pillbox that had been hammering them. From this side, he could see he seam where the concrete met the coral. He could see that the long firing slit didn't extend all the way around. There was a blind portion of wall where, if he could reach it, grenades could do their work. He waited for a lull. One came when the gun inside shifted to fire at another American movement further down the line. In those seconds, Jackson readied himself. He pulled the pin on one of his frag grenades, but kept the spoon pinned under his thumb. He counted, heart beating time. 1001, 1002. Loosening his grip just enough to let the fuse start, he popped up, leaned out, and sidearmed the grenade. It arced low, hit the pillbox's ledge just at the edge of the embrasure, and dropped inside. He ducked back and flattened again. The blast was savage at such close range. Concrete dust blasted out of the slit. Bits of steel clanged. There was a brief, shrill cry, and then silence from the gun. He didn't stop to congratulate himself. He scrambled forward, BR low. Swinging up onto the roof of the pillbox in a half roll, he reached the firing slit. Inside, in the dim recess, lay twisted bodies and a machine gun whose crew had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He leaned into the slit and hosed another 10-round burst into the interior for good measure, walking the muzzle across. Then he dropped back down behind the structure. He was now in the Japanese line. The next pillbox was maybe 20 yards away. From here, the geometry of the defense worked in his favor for the first time. These pillboxes had been built to fire out at the Americans, not back along the line. Their flanks and rear faces had less observation. Jackson used each captured position like a stepping stone. He moved along an interconnected trench where he could, and over the top of bunkers when he had to, always trying to approach the next strong point from a direction its crew wasn't fully covering. He would move as close as the terrain allowed, or pop up long enough to lob a grenade into an embrasure or doorway. Use the grenade. Blast as both weapon and distraction. Rush in with his BR at the ready, firing short, brutal bursts into anyone still alive inside. One of the first positions after that initial pillbox had a larger garrison. When his grenade went off, several Japanese burst from a side exit, some clutching rifles, one with a sword. At less than 15 yards, the BAR lived up to its reputation. Jackson fired in a snap from the hip, then brought the muzzle down as recoil tucked into his shoulder. 3 men went down almost immediately. A fourth stumbled on, then collapsed as a second burst reached him. In one dusty, chaotic moment, decades of weapons doctrine played out at point-blank range. Semi-automatic rifles and light automatics against bolt-action rifles in the hands of men reacting to shock. Jackson kept moving. At one position, he ran out of grenades and had to improvise. He crept up along the side of a bunker and found a small air shaft, just big enough to slip the muzzle of his bar into. He fired an entire magazine down it, each shot amplified by the hollow space, calculated guesses becoming for once near certainty. The gun got so hot, he had to gingerly change magazines, fingers scraping on the rough edges of the receiver. At another position, he encountered a Japanese soldier mid-stride coming along the trench toward him. They both froze for half a second, then both went for weapons. Jackson's bar, already slung low and in his hands, beat the other man's Arisaka by just enough. He fired a single shot, then 2 more as the enemy buckled. Throughout, he was dimly aware of being shot at from deeper in the line. Bullets snapped overhead. One round grazed his right hand, slashing across knuckles and sending a shock of pain up his arm. He ignored it. Adrenaline, a chemical as old as humans and as ugly as the places it takes us, kept him going. The men in T remaining pillboxes had to make their own choices. Do they abandon orientation on the main American line to deal with this one lunatic in their flank, or do they trust that he'll be taken out by one of their buddies 2 bunkers down? In the fog and confusion, enough chose poorly. By the time some of them realized what pattern was being cut through their arc, Jackson was already at their doors. Witnesses afterward tried to count bodies. In the immediate aftermath, with engineers moving through to finish off positions and collect intel, the number of dead in that sector blurred. Jackson's Medal of Honor citation credits him with killing 12 enemy pillboxes and 50 Japanese soldiers in that action. Some accounts go higher. The exact number is probably less important than the shape of it. He killed more men in 7 minutes than his rifle company had in some full engagements. He did it not with some supernatural skill, but with aggression at exactly the moment the defense wasn't expecting it. That aggression is what combat reward systems like the Medal of Honor are designed to note. But it also carries risks. If he'd misjudged one distance, if one grenade had come back out at him instead of in, if one defending crew had been slightly quicker to swing their gun, the same official record would list him as killed in action while attempting to assault enemy position. We would hear his story only as a line in a battalion log, more like hundreds of others who tried and died in similar circumstances. That he did not die does not make the decision different. It just makes the story louder. Back on the American side of the line, men in positions with slightly higher vantage points saw pieces of what was happening. They saw a Marine silhouetted on bunker roofs briefly, then vanishing behind them. They saw one pillbox after another stop firing, smoke drifting from their slits. They didn't know it was Jackson specifically until later. All they knew was that something had broken the spell of those concrete boxes. The company commander seized the moment. He ordered engineers forward. Demolition teams with satchel charges and flamethrowers rushed to exploit the breach. They used Jackson's captured bunkers as intermediate positions, leapfrogging, one group covering while the next advanced. Tanks, Shermans and flamethrower Stuarts, now at less risk from 47mm guns in the knocked-out pillboxes, edged closer, spraying fire into adjacent caves. Suddenly, where for 48 hours the southern line had been a blunt wall, there was a crack. Not a full-width breakthrough yet. But enough. Enough that, over the next day or two, Marines would pound through and begin the grinding job of reducing the rest of the peninsula. Jackson, after his solitary run, did what a lot of men who've been riding an adrenaline knife edge do when they finally stop moving. He crashed. His hearing was muffled. His cut hand swelled. Shock and exhaustion caught up. Someone shoved a canteen at him. He sipped, feeling each mouthful as if he were waking up from a dream. Content, in his 19-year-old's sense of the word, that he had done what he could for that slice of coral. The wider war did not pause to mark the moment. Peleliu would grind on for weeks. But his action had, on that day, altered the calculus for the men in his company and battalion. They knew, for the rest of their lives, that they had seen something nearly impossible. Peleliu, as a whole, remains controversial among historians. It was, by almost any measure, one of the bloodiest per-acre fights of the Pacific War. The 1st Marine Division suffered about 6,500 casualties out of 17,500 men, killed, wounded, and missing, in just over a month. The Army's 81st Infantry Division, which eventually relieved and reinforced them, took another 3,000-plus casualties. Total American casualties approached 10,000 for Haiti, an island whose strategic value has since been questioned. Japanese defenders died almost to the last man. Out of roughly 10,000, only a couple hundred were captured alive. Many modern analyses suggest that by the time Peleliu was invaded, its airfield was already of diminishing importance, and that bypassing it might have saved lives without altering the broader course of the war. Men like Arthur Jackson, who had been there, tended to see it differently. They knew only that they'd been sent, that they'd been asked to do nearly impossible things, and that sometimes someone did them. After Peleliu, Jackson went on to fight on Okinawa, another brutal cave and ridge campaign where individual initiative inside very small spaces could again mean the difference between life and death. His Medal of Honor was presented by President Truman in 1945. The citation reads, in part, "Fiercely confronting the enemy, Pavitt Jackson smashed the Japanese pillboxes and, at point-blank range, killing the occupants with his BR. In 7 minutes, he killed 50 of the enemy and knocked out 12 positions." It's the dry language of official recognition for something that, in the moment, was anything but dry. It doesn't talk about the barnacles in his ribs, the way coral dust burned in his eyes, the way a 19-year-old brain processes the fact that every friend around you has just been hit. It doesn't mention, cannot mention, how thin the line is between heroic and pointless, and how it's often visible only in the rearview mirror of survival. Jackson himself, in later life, downplayed the idea he'd done something mythic. He described it as just doing what needed to be done. Men who served with him tended to be less modest on his behalf. They would point to that one morning and say, if he hadn't gone, we'd have lost a lot more men trying it another way. That's how tactical decisions echo. Big wars are, in Staff College lecture, is about divisions and logistics and grand strategy. But on Peleliu, for 7 minutes on a strip of coral not much bigger than a basketball court, they were about one Marine, a BAR, a couple of grenades, and a refusal to die lying still. 54 Japanese tried to execute one American that morning. The plan didn't survive contact with him. History often remembers wars in numbers too large to feel. Jackson's 7 minutes are a reminder that sometimes, in the worst places, the crucial numbers are small. 1 man, 12 pillboxes, 50 dead enemies, 7 minutes, and, improbably, 1 kid who walked away.